December 7, 1941, dawned clear and calm over the Hawaiian Islands. The tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor reflecting a sky painted in shades of pink and gold as the sun began its ascent over the Pacific. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida tightened his flight gloves aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi, approximately 230 miles north of Oahu, leading a strike force of 183 aircraft toward a destination that would transform the course of human history. The Japanese pilot carried orders that had been meticulously planned for months, a calculated gamble designed to cripple American naval power in a single devastating blow before the United States could respond to Japanese expansion across the Pacific. Admiral Husband Kimmel stood on the grounds of his headquarters that peaceful Sunday morning, unaware that his Pacific fleet would soon become the target of an unprecedented assault. Thebes hummed with the lazy rhythm of weekend routine, sailors enjoying shore leave, officers attending breakfast meetings, and maintenance crews performing light duties on the 8 battleships moored along Battleship Row. Intelligence warnings had filtered through military channels in recent weeks, suggesting heightened tensions with Japan, but nothing indicated an imminent attack on American soil thousands of miles from any active theater of war. The diplomatic situation between Washington and Tokyo had deteriorated throughout 1941, with the United States imposing increasingly severe economic sanctions in response to Japanese military aggression in China and Southeast Asia. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had delivered what amounted to an ultimatum in late November, demanding Japanese withdrawal from occupied territories, but negotiations remained officially ongoing. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his cabinet believed war might be inevitable, yet they anticipated Japanese forces would strike British or Dutch colonial possessions rather than directly challenge American military installations. According to records preserved in the National Archives and documented extensively in Gordon Prange's definitive work, At Dawn We Slept, Japanese military leadership had concluded that neutralizing the Pacific Fleet represented their only viable strategy for securing the resources necessary to sustain their empire. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, had studied at Harvard University and served as naval attaché in Washington, understanding American industrial capacity better than most of his colleagues. He harbored deep reservations about prolonged conflict with the United States, reportedly warning that Japan might run wild for 6 months or a year, but expressing grave doubts about ultimate victory in an extended war. The strike force that approached Hawaii represented the most powerful naval aviation capability ever assembled to that point in history, with 6 aircraft carriers launching attack waves that would catch the American forces in a state of complete unpreparedness. Japanese intelligence had carefully monitored fleet movements, confirming that the carriers Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were absent from Pearl Harbor, but the primary targets remained the battleships that symbolized American naval might. The operation required extraordinary coordination, with torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighter escorts executing precisely choreographed attacks across multiple objectives simultaneously. The tranquility of that Sunday morning masked the approaching catastrophe, as American servicemen went about their routines completely unaware that hundreds of enemy aircraft were bearing down upon them through the dawn sky. 7:48 in the morning Hawaiian time marked the moment when Petty Officer First Class Kiyoshi Ogawa released his torpedo toward the battleship Oklahoma, the first weapon of hundreds that would rain down upon Pearl Harbor over the next 2 hours. Commander Fuchida transmitted the coded message, Tora, 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 back to the Japanese fleet, confirming that complete tactical surprise had been achieved, as the first bombs began exploding across Ford Island and the neat rows of aircraft parked at Wheeler Field and Hickam Field. The peaceful Sunday morning erupted into chaos as sailors and soldiers struggled to comprehend the impossible reality unfolding before their eyes. Private Joseph Lockhart and Private George Elliott had detected unusual radar returns at the Opana Point Station on Oahu's northern coast approximately an hour earlier, tracking what appeared to be a large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. The young operators reported their findings to the information center at Fort Shafter, but Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the inexperienced officer on duty, dismissed the contact as either a flight of American B-17 bombers expected from California or a technical malfunction. This fateful decision eliminated the only opportunity for any meaningful warning, allowing the Japanese strike force to achieve complete surprise despite American radar technology detecting their approach. Aboard the battleship Nevada, Ensign Joseph Taussig rushed to his battle station as the first explosions thundered across the harbor, his mind struggling to process the sight of aircraft bearing the distinctive red circle of the Japanese rising sun. The ship's band had just completed playing morning colors, the American flag rising on the stern as tradition demanded, when torpedo bombers roared across the water at masthead height. Taussig watched in horror as a torpedo struck the battleship Arizona moored nearby, the first of multiple hits that would doom the mighty vessel and 1,100 men trapped within her hull. The Oklahoma absorbed 5 torpedo strikes within the first 12 minutes of the attack, the tremendous explosions tearing open her port side below the waterline. Chief Water Tender Francis Flaherty and Ensign Adolphe Beaufin remained at their posts deep within the capsizing ship, directing sailors toward escape routes and holding flashlights to illuminate darkened passageways as seawater rushed through ruptured compartments. Both men perished when the Oklahoma rolled completely onto her side, trapping over 400 sailors inside the overturned hull, their heroic actions earning posthumous Congressional Medals of Honor. The surprise was so complete that many American personnel initially believed the attack represented a catastrophically realistic training exercise gone wrong. Rear Admiral Patrick Bellinger, who commanded patrol aircraft at Ford Island, reportedly remarked that whoever organized this drill deserved a court-martial for its dangerous realism. Before the awful truth became undeniable, ammunition lockers remained locked, requiring officers to physically break them open while under fire, and many anti-aircraft guns stood unmanned as crews struggled to reach their battle stations through smoke, flames, and falling bombs. Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with remarkable courage and precision, torpedo bombers threading between ship masts at altitudes barely clearing 50 feet, while anti-aircraft fire began filling the sky. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Murata led the torpedo attack against Battleship Roe, his skilled pilots executing the difficult shallow water launches that conventional doctrine considered impossible. The Americans had assumed Pearl Harbor's depth of approximately 40 feet provided protection against aerial torpedoes, but Japanese engineers had modified their weapons with wooden fins that enabled attacks in shallow harbors. The first wave continued for approximately 30 minutes, methodically working through assigned targets as American defenders gradually organized resistance. 8:10 in the morning witnessed the most catastrophic single event of the entire attack when a modified 16-inch naval shell, converted into an armor-piercing bomb, penetrated the forward magazine of the battleship Arizona, detonating over 1 million pounds of gunpowder in an explosion that literally lifted the 30-2-1,000-ton vessel out of the water. Seaman First Class Russell Lott, stationed on the repair ship Vestal moored alongside the Arizona, described the fireball rising hundreds of feet into the air, the concussion wave throwing men overboard and raining debris across the harbor. The Arizona settled rapidly onto the shallow bottom, her forward superstructure completely destroyed, taking 1,177 officers and enlisted men to their deaths in mere moments. Captain Franklin Van Vengberg commanded the Arizona from the bridge, maintaining his post even as flames engulfed the ship's superstructure. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, commander of Battleship Division 1, stood beside Van Valkenburg when the catastrophic explosion tore through the vessel, both officers vanishing in the inferno. Witnesses reported seeing Admiral Kidd on the bridge wing moments before the magazine detonation, calmly observing the battle despite the chaos surrounding him. Neither officer's remains were ever identified, their bodies consumed in temperatures that melted steel and fused metal structures into twisted sculptures of destruction. The explosion aboard Arizona created a massive oil slick that spread across the harbor, the thick black fuel igniting into sheets of flame that trapped men in the water between burning death and drowning. Sailors jumped from sinking ships directly into these infernos, many perishing in the flaming oil before rescuers could reach them. Motor launches and small boats crisscrossed the harbor under continuous bombardment, their crews pulling survivors from the water with complete disregard for their own safety. Chief Boatswain's Mate Joseph George commanded a launch from the Vestal, making repeated trips into burning oil slicks to rescue swimmers, his actions saving numerous lives while Japanese aircraft strafed the harbor. Historical accounts compiled by the Naval History and Heritage Command document how the crew of the repair ship Vestal fought desperately to save their own vessel while Arizona burned alongside them. Commander Cassin Young ordered Vestal away from the doomed battleship, then personally cut the mooring lines when his crew proved unable to release them quickly enough. The repair ship managed to beach herself on Aya Shoal, preventing her complete loss, though she sustained significant damage from bomb hits and the Arizona explosion. Commander Young received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the attack, maintaining control of his ship and crew under impossible circumstances. The West Virginia absorbed 7 torpedo hits and 2 bomb strikes, settling upright on the harbor bottom through the heroic damage control efforts led by Lieutenant Commander John Harper. Harper organized counter-flooding of starboard compartments to prevent capsizing, deliberately sacrificing portions of his ship to save the vessel from rolling over like Oklahoma. The West Virginia's commanding officer, Captain Mervyn Benyon, sustained mortal wounds from bomb fragments early in the attack but refused evacuation, remaining on his bridge directing defensive fire until losing consciousness from blood loss. Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller, a black sailor assigned to collect laundry, manned an anti-aircraft gun despite never receiving formal weapons training, firing at attacking aircraft until ammunition ran out. The California, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, began settling slowly after 2 torpedo strikes ruptured her hull below the waterline. Damage control parties fought flooding through multiple compartments, but open manholes and loose fittings undermined their efforts. The ship's material condition had been compromised by an ongoing yard period, with watertight doors and hatches not properly secured for combat operations. Radio electrician Thomas Reeves remained in a flooding compartment passing ammunition topside until seawater reached overhead, drowning at his post while ensuring guns above him maintained fire. 8:25 marked the approximate end of the first attack wave as Japanese aircraft completed their primary objectives and began withdrawing toward their carriers, leaving behind a harbor transformed into a scene from Dante's Inferno. Commander Logan Ramsey broadcast the famous message, "Air Raid Pearl Harbor." This is not drill across military communication networks, alerting forces throughout Oahu and the Pacific that America had been thrust into war. Fires raged across Battleship Row, smoke columns rising thousands of feet into the tropical sky, while desperate rescue efforts intensified as the lull between attack waves provided brief respite from the aerial onslaught. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuka directed damage control and evacuation efforts aboard the burning Arizona, organizing the systematic rescue of survivors from the shattered vessel despite his own injuries. Fuqua established order from chaos, calmly directing sailors to abandon ship while ensuring wounded men received priority during evacuation. He remained aboard until confirming no living sailors remained accessible, the last officer to leave the dying battleship. His leadership earned the Medal of Honor, recognized as exemplifying the courage displayed by countless American servicemen who transformed the surprise attack from a complete disaster into a demonstration of remarkable resilience and determination. Across the harbor at the submarine base, personnel worked frantically to move ammunition and torpedoes away from potential targets while preparing submarines for emergency deployment. The Tautog became the first American submarine to sink a Japanese vessel during the war when she destroyed a Miite submarine attempting to enter Pearl Harbor, one of 5 two-man craft launched from fleet submarines offshore. These Miite submarines represented a separate component of the Japanese plan, intended to penetrate the harbor defenses and launch torpedoes at battleships during the confusion of the air attack, though none successfully completed their mission. The Nevada made a bold attempt to escape the harbor during the lull between attacks, getting underway despite torpedo and bomb damage sustained during the first wave. Chief Quartermaster Robert Sedbury conned the ship from the navigation bridge after senior officers were killed or incapacitated, guiding the battleship toward the harbor entrance while damage control parties fought fires and flooding below decks. Japanese dive bombers concentrated on the Nevada during the second wave, recognizing that a ship sinking in the narrow channel would bottle up the entire Pacific Fleet. Commander Jesse Kenworthy eventually ordered the ship beached at Hospital Point rather than risk blocking the entrance, a decision that proved strategically sound despite the Nevada's additional damage. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor achieved the distinction of becoming the first American pilots to engage Japanese aircraft when they took off from Hialewa Field in P-40 Warhawk fighters during the attack. Both pilots had been playing poker at Wheeler Field Officers Club when the attack commenced, immediately racing to Hialewa where their aircraft had been dispersed for training exercises. Welch and Taylor made multiple sorties throughout the attack, claiming 6 Japanese aircraft destroyed between them, demonstrating that American forces could fight back effectively once organized. Their aggressive action provided inspiration to demoralized personnel witnessing the destruction of the Pacific Fleet. According to official after-action reports housed at the National Archives, medical personnel across Oahu performed miraculous work under impossible conditions. The hospital at Pearl Harbor received hundreds of casualties within the first hour, doctors and nurses operating continuously for days treating burns, shrapnel wounds, and traumatic injuries of every description. Civilian hospitals throughout Honolulu opened their doors to military casualties, medical staff working without rest as the wounded continued arriving throughout December 7th and into the following days. Blood supplies ran critically short, with military personnel and civilians lining up to donate, the crisis spurring development of blood banking techniques that would save countless lives throughout the coming war. 854 brought renewed terror as Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki led 171 aircraft of the second attack wave over Oahu, focusing primarily on damaged ships, shore installations, and airfields already devastated during the first strike. The tactical focus shifted from torpedoes to dive bombing and strafing, Japanese pilots working methodically through secondary targets while American anti-aircraft fire had grown significantly more organized and deadly. Lessons learned through blood during the first wave now translated into improved defensive coordination, gunners finding their rhythm and knocking Japanese aircraft from the sky with increasing frequency. The Pennsylvania, resting in Dry Dock No. 1 alongside destroyers Cassin and Downs, became a primary target during the second wave. Bombs struck all 3 vessels, fires spreading rapidly through the confined dry dock space. The destroyers eventually became total losses when fuel and ammunition detonated, spectacular explosions lifting the ships off their blocks and dropping them in twisted ruins at the dry dock bottom. Shipyard workers and military personnel fought desperately to save the Pennsylvania, successfully preventing catastrophic damage to the battleship, though she sustained significant wounds requiring months of repair work. Civilian workers displayed extraordinary courage throughout the attack, many continuing their duties despite having no military obligation to remain in the combat zone. Hickam Field endured renewed assault during the second wave, Japanese dive bombers clearing runways and destroying hangars already damaged during the initial strike. Technical Sergeant William Schick continued directing anti-aircraft fire despite serious wounds, maintaining his post until collapsing from blood loss. Across the field at the Consolidated Barracks, soldiers had established first aid stations and organized defensive positions during the brief lull, managing to evacuate most personnel from the building before bombs struck the structure during the second attack. The massive barracks sustained catastrophic damage, portions of the building collapsing into rubble that trapped wounded men beneath tons of concrete and steel. Wheeler Field, headquarters of Army Air Forces Fighter Command in Hawaii, suffered devastating attacks on both waves as Japanese planners correctly identified it as the primary obstacle to achieving air superiority over Oahu. Neat rows of P-40 and P-36 fighters parked wingtip to wingtip for security. Against sabotage became simple targets, strafing runs destroying dozens of aircraft before pilots could reach them. A handful of fighters managed to get airborne despite the chaos, pilots demonstrating extraordinary skill and courage in engaging vastly superior numbers of Japanese aircraft. Second, Lieutenant Philip Rasmussen took off with his P-36's wheel well covers still in place, pajamas visible beneath his flight suit, scoring probable hits on a Japanese bomber, despite his aircraft suffering multiple battle damage. The destroyer Shaw, stationed in floating dry dock alongside Ford Island, absorbed 3 bomb hits that detonated her forward magazine in a spectacular explosion photographed and filmed for posterity. The massive fireball shooting skyward became one of the most iconic images of the attack, captured on film by photographers who maintained their positions despite Japanese strafing runs. The shoal's forward structure completely disintegrated, yet damaged control bodies saved the remainder of the ship, which eventually received a temporary bow and steamed to the mainland for complete reconstruction. This exemplified the remarkable salvage efforts that would characterize Pearl Harbor in the months following the attack. Kaneohe Naval Air Station on Oahu's windward coast endured concentrated strafing attacks that destroyed virtually every PBY Catalina patrol aircraft based there. Aviation Ordnanceman 3rd Class John Finn set up a machine gun in a completely exposed position, maintaining fire at attacking aircraft despite sustaining over 20 wounds. Finn refused medical treatment throughout the attack, continuing to direct anti-aircraft fire and organize defensive positions until the last Japanese aircraft departed. His extraordinary valor earned the Medal of Honor, representing the courage displayed by personnel at installations across Oahu. The second wave concluded around 9:45, Japanese aircraft withdrawing toward their carriers as fuel and ammunition ran low. 1,000 hours brought an eerie silence across Pearl Harbor as the last Japanese aircraft disappeared over the northern horizon, leaving behind a scene of unprecedented devastation and heroism intermingled with tragedy on a scale the United States had never experienced on its own soil. The Pacific Fleet's battle line had effectively ceased to exist. With Arizona destroyed beyond any hope of salvage, Oklahoma capsized in the mud with over 400 men entombed within her hull, and California, West Virginia, and Nevada sunk in shallow water. Maryland and Tennessee sustained moderate damage, while Pennsylvania received lighter wounds. Only the aircraft carriers, absent from Pearl Harbor through fortune rather than design, survived to fight another day. Admiral Kemal stood on the grounds of his headquarters watching the harbor burn, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his command had been effectively destroyed under his watch. A spent round struck the admiral's chest as he surveyed the destruction, the bullet lacking sufficient force to penetrate his uniform but leaving a bruise over his heart. Kemal reportedly remarked that it would have been better if the bullet had killed him, his words reflecting the anguish of a commander who bore responsibility for the disaster regardless of whether adequate warning had been provided. Within days, both Kemal and Lieutenant General Walter Short would be relieved of their commands, their careers destroyed by the catastrophe at Pearl Harbor. The human cost proved devastating beyond the material losses, with 2,335 American servicemen and 68 civilians killed during the 2-hour attack. An additional 1,178 military personnel and 35 civilians sustained wounds ranging from minor injuries to life-altering trauma. The Arizona alone accounted for nearly half of all fatalities, her crew obliterated in the magazine explosion that transformed the battleship into a tomb. The Oklahoma contributed 415 dead, many suffocating in flooded compartments as the ship rolled, while rescue parties worked desperately to cut through the hull to reach trapped sailors. Commander Fuchida circled above the carnage after the second wave withdrew, observing the destruction and debating whether to recommend a third strike against shore installations and fuel storage facilities. The Japanese commander recognized that Pearl Harbor's repair facilities remained largely intact, as did the massive fuel tank farms whose destruction would have crippled American operations in the Pacific for years. However, Japanese doctrine emphasized achieving objectives with minimum risk, and losses during the second wave suggested that American defenses were becoming increasingly effective. Admiral Kiichi Nagamo, commanding the carrier strike force, chose to withdraw without launching additional attacks, a decision that would prove strategically significant as American salvage efforts recovered most of the sunken battleships. According to estimates compiled by military historians and documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's Comprehensive Naval History series, Japanese forces lost 29 aircraft, 5 Miite submarines, and approximately 65 personnel during the attack. These losses represented approximately 5% of attacking aircraft, a remarkably low casualty rate that reflected both tactical surprise and the overwhelming superiority of Japanese naval aviation at this stage of the war. American forces managed to shoot down only 9 aircraft during the first wave, but destroyed 20 during the second attack as defenses organized, suggesting that a third wave would have encountered significantly stiffer resistance. The strategic impact of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate tactical results, fundamentally transforming American public opinion regarding involvement in World War II. Isolationist sentiment, which had dominated American politics throughout the late 1930s, evaporated overnight as rage and determination to avenge the surprise attack united the nation. President Roosevelt would address Congress the following day, December 8, 1941, delivering his famous date, which will live in infamy speech, and requesting a declaration of war against Japan. The Senate approved the declaration with only one dissenting vote, Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, casting the sole opposition ballot as she had during World War I. The attack's timing, executed while diplomatic negotiations continued in Washington, generated particular outrage that transcended normal wartime animosity. December 8th dawned over a transformed Pearl Harbor, the morning sun illuminating a scene that bore no resemblance to the peaceful naval base that had existed just 24 hours earlier. Salvage operations commenced almost immediately, with rescue parties cutting through the overturned hull of Oklahoma, using acetylene torches in desperate efforts to reach sailors trapped alive in air pockets. 32 men were eventually rescued from the capsized battleship, their survival dependent upon the speed with which cutting crews could reach them before oxygen supplies exhausted or compartments flooded. The last survivors emerged on December 9th, 4 days after the attack, their ordeal demonstrating both human resilience and the complexity of salvage operations that would continue for years. Rear Admiral William Furlong assumed temporary command of salvage efforts, organizing teams to control fires, pump out flooded compartments, and recover bodies from sunken vessels. The Navy established a massive salvage organization, eventually numbering over 15,000 personnel, developing innovative techniques for raising capsized ships and repairing vessels that conventional wisdom considered total losses. The Oklahoma required until March 1943 to right and refloat, an engineering achievement accomplished through installing 21 massive winches, a shore that slowly rotated the 30-2-1000-ton hull over a period of months. She would never return to combat service, but the engineering knowledge gained proved invaluable for future operations. The Nevada, beached at Hospital Point to prevent her sinking in the navigation channel, became a priority for repair efforts. Salvage teams patched torpedo and bomb damage sufficiently to refloat the battleship by February 1942, beginning a remarkable journey that would see Nevada completely reconstructed and return to combat operations. She eventually participated in the Normandy invasion in June 1944 and subsequent operations in both European and Pacific theaters, her survival and return to service symbolizing American industrial determination and naval resilience. Similar efforts restored West Virginia and California to combat-worthy condition, both battleships rejoining the fleet in time for the later campaigns of the Pacific War. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day 1941 to assume command of the Pacific Fleet, inheriting a situation that appeared nearly hopeless. The cautious, methodical Nimitz brought both strategic vision and profound understanding of naval warfare, immediately recognizing that the carrier force, unscathed during the attack, represented America's only offensive capability in the Pacific. His leadership would prove instrumental in organizing the defensive campaigns that blunted Japanese expansion during early 1942, buying time for American industrial mobilization to shift into high gear. Nimitz famously remarked that the Japanese had made 3 critical errors at Pearl Harbor: awakening a sleeping giant, failing to destroy repair facilities, and missing the carriers. Medical personnel continued working around the clock throughout the week following the attack, treating wounded while simultaneously establishing morgues for handling the staggering number of dead. Identification of remains proved extraordinarily difficult, particularly from ships like Arizona, where intense fires had consumed bodies beyond recognition. The Navy established identification procedures that combined dental records, personal effects, and physical characteristics, work that continued for months as bodies were gradually recovered from sunken ships. Many remains were never identified. These unknown servicemen eventually interred at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, where they rest alongside thousands of other Americans who died throughout the Pacific War. War hysteria gripped Hawaii in the attack's aftermath, with martial law declared and military authorities assuming complete control over civilian government. Japanese Americans, comprising approximately one-third of Hawaii's population, faced immediate suspicion despite the complete absence of any sabotage or fifth-column activity during the attack. Unlike the mass internment implemented on the mainland, Hawaii's Japanese American population proved too large and too economically important to relocate, though many individuals faced restrictions and surveillance. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed primarily of Japanese American soldiers from Hawaii, would become the most decorated unit in American military history, their combat record in Europe demonstrating the absolute loyalty of Japanese Americans despite the prejudice they endured. December 9th witnessed the commencement of multiple investigations examining how Japanese forces achieved complete tactical surprise despite American possession of radar technology and intelligence suggesting increased tensions. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox arrived in Hawaii to conduct the first official inquiry. His report delivered to President Roosevelt on December 15th, concluding that commanders in Hawaii bore significant responsibility for their lack of preparedness. This initial assessment would be followed by 8 additional investigations spanning the war years and beyond, each attempting to untangle the complex web of intelligence failures, communication breakdowns, and command decisions that contributed to the disaster. The Roberts Commission, headed by Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts, convened in Washington during December 1941 to conduct a more comprehensive examination of Pearl Harbor events. The commission heard testimony from over 100 witnesses, including Admiral Kimmel and General Short, both officers already relieved of command and effectively presumed guilty by public opinion demanding accountability. The Roberts Report, issued in January 1942, concluded that both commanders had failed to implement adequate defensive measures despite receiving war warnings from Washington, recommending courts-martial for both officers. This finding proved controversial even at the time, with many observers noting that the Commission's predetermined conclusions overlooked systemic failures extending beyond Hawaii. Intelligence regarding Japanese intentions had been available through magic intercepts of Japanese diplomatic communications, though the information proved ambiguous and subject to multiple interpretations. Washington had transmitted war warnings to Pacific commands throughout late November, but these messages lacked specificity regarding timing or targets. The famous "Winds Execute" message, allegedly confirming Japanese intentions to break diplomatic relations, has been debated by historians for decades, with questions remaining about whether such a message was ever actually broadcast or intercepted. The fog of intelligence proved as dangerous as the fog of war, with critical information available but not properly analyzed or disseminated to commanders who needed it most. According to research compiled in various investigations and historical analyses, including Roberta Wohlstetter's seminal study, Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision, the attack succeeded primarily through effective deception and operational security rather than any single catastrophic intelligence failure. Japanese forces maintained radio silence during their approach, while transmitting false traffic from home waters to mask the carrier force's absence. American intelligence officers expected Japanese expansion toward Southeast Asia, focusing collection efforts on those regions while Pearl Harbor seemed too distant to represent a logical target. The cognitive bias of assumed invulnerability, where commanders could not imagine enemies possessing the capability or audacity to strike American territory, proved more dangerous than any specific intelligence gap. Admiral Kimmel and General Short spent the remainder of their lives attempting to clear their names, arguing that Washington bore equal or greater responsibility for the disaster through its failure to adequately warn Hawaii of the imminent danger. The debate over Pearl Harbor responsibility continues even into the 21st century, with congressional hearings as recently as 1999 examining whether both officers deserved posthumous advancement to four-star rank. The question of accountability proved complex, involving competing narratives about centralized versus decentralized command authority and the appropriate balance between Washington's global strategic perspective and local commanders' immediate tactical responsibilities. The psychological impact of Pearl Harbor on American strategic thinking proved profound and long-lasting, establishing a national determination to never again suffer a surprise attack. This mindset would influence American defense policy throughout the Cold War, driving massive investments in intelligence collection and early warning systems. The shock of December 7th taught strategists that technological superiority meant nothing without proper preparation and operational alertness, lessons reinforced by later events but originating in the burning wreckage floating in Pearl Harbor. Multiple conspiracy theories emerged during and after the war, suggesting President Roosevelt possessed advanced knowledge of the attack but allowed it to proceed to justify American entry into World War II. Serious historians have thoroughly debunked these allegations, demonstrating that while Roosevelt certainly hoped to support Britain and oppose Axis expansion, no credible evidence suggests he sacrificed American lives at Pearl Harbor to achieve political objectives. The reality proved more mundane but equally tragic: standard confusion and bureaucratic dysfunction combined with enemy excellence producing catastrophic results. December 7th evolved from a specific date into a phrase synonymous with devastating surprise attack, entering the American lexicon as shorthand for catastrophic failure of vigilance. The battleship Arizona became a national shrine. Her hull designated a war grave where the remains of over 900 sailors rest in eternal vigil beneath the turquoise waters of Pearl Harbor. The USS Arizona Memorial, dedicated in 1962, straddles the sunken battleship without touching her corroded hull, a graceful white structure where visitors pay respects to those who died and contemplate the terrible price of war. Oil still seeps from Arizona's fuel tanks decades after the attack, dark droplets rising to the surface that mourners call the tears of the Arizona. The National Park Service maintains the World War II Valor in the Pacific National Monument, encompassing the Arizona Memorial. The battleship Missouri, where Japanese representatives signed surrender documents in September 1945, and the USS Bowfin Submarine Museum. These vessels spanning the war's beginning and end create a powerful narrative arc, allowing visitors to comprehend both the catastrophe that began American involvement and the ultimate victory achieved through sacrifice and determination. More than 2 million people visit Pearl Harbor annually, making it one of Hawaii's most popular destinations despite the somber nature of the site. Survivors of Pearl Harbor formed associations dedicated to preserving memories of December 7th and honoring fallen comrades. These veterans attended annual commemorations at Pearl Harbor throughout the late 20th century, their numbers inevitably declining as time claimed those whom Japanese bombs and torpedoes had spared. The last survivors reached their 90s and beyond during the early 21st century, living links to an event that transformed America and the world. Lou Counter, one of the last surviving crew members of the Arizona, continued sharing his experiences into his 100th year of life, ensuring that younger generations understood the personal dimensions of historical events. The attack's strategic consequences proved almost opposite to Japanese intentions, unifying American public opinion and unleashing industrial mobilization that produced military forces vastly exceeding what Japan could field. Admiral Yamamoto's prescient warning about America's capacity for sustained warfare proved accurate. The Pacific War ultimately decided by production rather than individual combat prowess. American shipyards launched Essex-class aircraft carriers by the dozens while Japanese yards struggled to replace vessels lost at Midway and later battles. The battleships sunk at Pearl Harbor proved less important than anticipated, as carrier aviation dominated Pacific warfare, but American determination to avenge December 7th drove mobilization that crushed Axis resistance across two oceans simultaneously. The lessons of Pearl Harbor resonated through subsequent generations of military planners, informing everything from Cold War early warning systems to modern cybersecurity doctrine. The intelligence failures that enabled Japanese surprise-informed creation of centralized intelligence agencies, including the Central Intelligence Agency, charged with preventing future Pearl Harbors. The concept of defense in depth, maintaining multiple layers of warning and response rather than relying on single systems, emerged directly from analyzing what went wrong on December 7th. Military education incorporated Pearl Harbor case studies, ensuring officers understood how overconfidence and inadequate preparation created vulnerability regardless of technological advantages. The human stories emerging from Pearl Harbor continued resonating decades after the attack, tales of courage and sacrifice that defined American character during what Tom Brokaw termed the greatest generation. Doris. Miller's actions manning anti-aircraft guns despite his assignment to menial duties as a black sailor highlighted both the heroism of individuals and the tragic reality of segregation that denied opportunities based on race. Miller received the Navy Cross, the first black American so honored during World War II, though he perished in 1943 when Japanese torpedoes sank the escort carrier Liscum Bay. His example helped support arguments for military desegregation eventually implemented by President Harry Truman in 1948. The fraternity between American and Japanese veterans that developed in later decades demonstrated humanity's capacity for reconciliation even after terrible conflict. Japanese pilots who attacked Pearl Harbor attended commemorations alongside American survivors, former enemies sharing memories and acknowledging the waste and tragedy of war. Commander Fukita converted to Christianity after the war, dedicating his later life to promoting peace and reconciliation between former adversaries. These personal connections illustrated that while nations fight wars, individuals ultimately choose whether to perpetuate hatred or seek understanding. The battleship Missouri, permanently moored near the Arizona Memorial, represents both bookends of the Pacific War, her decks witnessing the surrender ceremony that ended global conflict begun at Pearl Harbor. Visitors walking Missouri's teak decks stand where General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japanese capitulation, the circle closing on 3 years and 8 months of brutal warfare across the Pacific. The proximity of these two vessels, one marking war's beginning and the other its conclusion, creates a powerful meditation on the costs and consequences of military conflict. December 7, 1941 remains seared into American historical consciousness, a moment when the nation's sense of invulnerability shattered and the comfortable illusion of geographic isolation from global conflicts evaporated. The attack killed over 2,000 Americans, destroyed or damaged 19 ships and over 300 aircraft, and transformed the United States from a reluctant observer into the arsenal of democracy that ultimately determined the Second World War's outcome. The sailors and soldiers who perished at Pearl Harbor did not die in vain, their sacrifice galvanizing a nation that mobilized with unprecedented determination to defeat tyranny across two oceans simultaneously. Their memorial continues teaching new generations about the eternal cost of freedom and the necessity of remaining vigilant against threats that believe surprise and audacity can overcome American resolve. The tears of the Arizona still rise from her grave, reminding us that the price of peace remains eternal vigilance and the courage to stand against aggression wherever it threatens freedom.